Okay, now we've got our blocking in, our piece in, it taped, and now we can start putting mud on it. And for a simple patch like this, you know, as I showed, you can just go get, you know, a little bucket of mud, CGC, dust control, or anything, but the sheetrock 45, it's a powdered mix. You add water to it, and then it will dry a little harder, so it's harder to sand, but it's just a better first coat. But for this sake, we'll just use normal mud. I should go over techniques of how to use your knife. A lot of it's all feel. So I typically hold the knife in my hand like that, and I put my 2 fingers on the back. That way I can adjust the pressure on one side of the blade or the other while I'm making my pass. Now, when you have mud on your knife, you want to kind of keep it at a 45, and that way you can apply the mud and smear it. If you have it too straight, you will obviously scrape all the mud off. If you have it too flat, you will spread the mud at the start of your pass. That being said, there are times where we are going to be doing all these motions in our pass. There are times where once you get the mud on, you want it to be flat to smooth out the mud and spread it equally. There are times where you want to scrape the mud completely clean, like on our perimeter. But for the most part, when you are spreading mud, you kind of want it to be on a 45, and you just equally put the pressure on the knife up and down in the middle and give it a nice coat. That is a lot of feel, and you'll get it more as you use a knife. You're just trying to get enough mud at the tip of your knife and simply applying it that way. Now, if you can see as I'm making these passes, we're getting these streaks and lines in here. That's from hardened and dried mud that might have already been on your knife, on the inside of the bucket or bag. So try to keep your tools and your material, your mud, as clean as possible. So wipe down the inside of your bucket, wipe down your tools periodically. If you're taking a break, try not to let it sit and dry, and that will minimize having clumps like that in your mud as you go to do work. So as you can see, like, you know, you make a nice pass, and then you have a clump that decides to create a void and a line through your pass. It's not the end of the world. Make another pass, hopefully get that out. Now keep in mind that that clump is probably in this group of mud somewhere. So if I go to put that back into my mud that I'm working with, that clump will probably show up again. So we can keep it to the side and continue working with our clean mud. So again, pretty easy, 45, smear the mud. End of the knife, smear it. Again, if we're spreading it, we want the knife to be a little flatter. If we're clearing it off, we want it to be straighter. And if we're just applying it, we want it to be on a 45. So this takes a little bit of practice. I mean, it's still a little messy, but you want to kind of nicely fold the mud over like dough almost, I guess you could say. So the first thing you want to do is press the mud into those gaps. If you just kind of coat it, maybe if we go from to the back side, you'll see the difference. So you can see there how I pushed a lot of mud into the top, and there's mud in there, just not pushed in all the way. So you don't want to do your first fill without that. So, oh, and we can see that we have a screw that's not synced there. Perfect. So we get the mud into all the grooves there, work that in. Now we've got all the mud into the grooves. Now we can put our first coat on. So anytime you coat anything, any seam, any joint, you want to split it halfway, and that's what you keep doing, and you keep using that as a reference to build out your seam. Half. There. Now you might as well cover that, right? So there you go. Now we've got a good coverage. So we got a lot of mud on here. So now this is where, if you left it like this and we're like, yeah, that's good. You know, when that dries, it's going to be really hard to sand and you're going to hate drywall. And this is why everyone hates drywall. So we got to keep, less is a lot more in this case. Now you want to go half again. So we went half on the seam. Now we're going to go half on our edge. So you want to keep pressure on your outside edge. So I'm going to be keeping pressure on that edge as I swipe down. So I'll be trying to wipe this and smear it almost and push it like a snowplow over into the middle. So pressure, swipe down, and you can see I've taken almost a paper. Again, snowplow, pressure on the outside, boom, pressure on the outside, down, pressure on the outside, down. So now we've cleaned up our edges. Swipe, pass, and then swipe down the middle. So we want something to look like that, where we can still see where it's gone into the tape a little bit. I'm not worried about that. Maybe the height is a little thin here. This is really good here. I'm okay with that. That's our first coat, but maybe something like that, and you can just. Now don't play with this. The more you play with it, the worse it will get sometimes. But sometimes you just need to go over it with a little bit of a lighter hand. And there we go. So I'm okay with that. We'll let that dry. Okay, so now that our mud is dry, we can go ahead and put on a second coat. So we're going to take a closer look at what's going on this patch. Yesterday, I coated half of it as what I would normally coat and what I consider a good job. And I left this kind of a little messy. Maybe this is what you'll be looking at home when you go to do it. You're trying to aim for this, but this is what you want to look for. You don't have a lot of ridges like this. You don't have a lot of buildup on the outside. The outside is swept nice and clean, so that it's almost smooth. And less is more. Less is always more. I know you kind of get the idea of a patch and you want to put on a bunch of mud and think that it's going to cover it. That's not what the idea is. That's not what you want to be doing. You want to gradually build it out. So if it takes you 4 or 5 coats, it takes you 4 or 5 coats. So if you are looking at this at home after you've done your first coat, it's not the end of the world. It's just more work. So if you ask anyone what they do not like about drywall, they will say sanding. That's why you want to try and keep your patch looking like this opposed to this. I don't really need to sand this or do anything to this patch. Maybe a light scratch and I'm already on to my second coat. This, I'm gonna have to give a little bit of love and elbow grease to get to my second coat. So the first thing you want to do is scrape down heavily the ridges. See, we got rid of that ridge. So go ahead and scrape down the outside. And you want to try and get those ridges out as best as possible. If you can't get the ridges out, and you want to grab a sanding sponge and give it a light sand and kind of sand out some of it. I've got it nice and smooth again. I got rid of most of the mess there, and now I'm ready for my second coat. I've already done a second coat over here, and you can obviously tell the difference. The patch is starting to fade away. You can't see the dimples. and I've floated it out a little bit bigger. I like establishing my perimeter, splitting the difference, and then filling in the middle. Then after that, I wipe the excess off the perimeters, as we did with this first pass, putting pressure on the outside of the blade, working the mud more into the middle, and then doing a sweep. Split the difference, like this, like so. Split the difference, like so. Split the difference. Split the difference. There. So now we've got that coated, and again, pressure on the outside. Pressure on the outside. Clean up the edges first. That's the first thing we do. So my edges are all nice and clean. I've worked the mud into the middle. And that's something that you want to look for, you're aiming for on a second coat. There's not a lot of ridges. It's very flat and smooth, less work, quicker. I'm not wasting time sanding, and it's ready to go for another coat. Okay, so now we're ready for a third or fourth coat or final coat, depending on how it's looking. And if you had to sand your patch to get it smooth before you coat it, it may look dust free. There is dust on there, and if you try to start coating it with the dust on there, it's going to clump up and cause a mess. So get a broom or a brush and give it a sweep and get that loose dust off. It's not going to clump up on you when you go to make your passes. Also, once you get to your final sanding and you're done with it, give everything a sweep and a vacuum. And that way, when you go to prime and paint, the dust isn't going to clump up your paint or your primer. On the third coat, we're really aiming to get no ridges, as flat, as smooth as possible. But again, we're going to split the difference. And at this stage, we really don't need to build it out too much more, but we do always want to overlap a little bit. And there we go, we have our third coat on. We'll let that dry, it's ready for sanding. Now, if you do get it to this point and you look at it and you go, I don't need to sand it, that's not the case. The mud will leave a texture, and you'll see that when you go to prime and paint it. So even though there is no ridges, it's nice and smooth, we still have to sand it. I know, it sucks.